Early November 1943, the Greater East Asia Conference was held at the Hibiya Hokkaido Square. Delegates from various Axis powers were present to discuss the aims and hopes of the Axis struggle to liberate both Asia, Europe, and the rest of the world from the tyranny of the New World Order and its allied powers. The convention laid out the following. 1. A clear declaration of the dangers posed to Asia and the rest of the world by the allied powers. 2. A warning regarding the destiny of Asia should the allied powers win the war and thus conquer the world. 3. An affirmation of the Axis cause as a holy crusade against international slavery. 4. A total affirmation of one struggle against the allied powers. 5. A total recognition of the sovereignty of all Asian peoples. 6. A reaffirmation of the sovereignty of all European peoples. 7. A worldwide condemnation of Judeo-Masonic imperialism. 8. A pledge of continued cooperation to defend Asia and Europe from the continual tyrannical aggressions of the British Empire, the United States of America, and the Soviet Union. 9. The total eradication of all subversive internationalism that threatens both Asia and the rest of the world. 10. A pledge for a world peace that would not infringe or undermine any people's national sovereignty and well-being. The following delegates took part in this convention.
大東亜結集国民大会は成都日比谷公園において挙行され、半個のうちに東條首相登壇。
いよいよこの行動の使命に徹し、一生不動の信念のもと、その総力を凝集して、あくまでも大東亜戦争を完遂し、再び大東亜において、前衛の少量跋扈を許さず、もって世界新秩序の建設に協力せんことを期し、決議。いよいよ大東亜各国代表の挨拶に入る。人人连成钢铁一般的人格，东亚也具有了钢铁一般的万里长城。我对于王代表の熱弁に率いる中国留学生。祝大东亚战争的胜利，在东亚公民建设的成功。ประเทศไทยฉันขออาราธนาคุณพระศรีรัตนตรัยจงดลบันดาลให้กองทัพของสมเด็จพระจักรพรรดิญี่ปุ่นประสบชัยชนะถึงที่สุดและให้จักรวรรดิญี่ปุ่นมีความเจริญยิ่งขึ้นสืบไปเถิด本日议政会以议政会共同召开国民大会之际，对亲往日本国民各位多数议员表示了衷心轻快。That the Philippines no longer will return to that period of political and economic slavery, but will join with the other peoples of Greater East Asia in the hope that all the peoples of Greater East Asia will enjoy the common prosperity, the common blessings of life, the common traditions, and the common heritage of Asia, which has always been the cradle of human civilization. I thank you. I stand here before you as a soldier from the western front line of the present Great East Asiatic War. I am speaking to you today like a soldier, giving you a message, a soldier's message from the western front line in Asia. sisters and brothers of Nippon, allow me first of all to thank you from the bottom of my heart for the exceedingly warm and cordial welcome you have given us this morning.
また名邦ドイツ代表もこれに加わり、道義一つに結ばれた参会者の戦意はいよいよ上がったのであります。
Eure Exzellenzen, meine Herren, die feierliche Kundgebung des heutigen Tages hat einen tiefen symbolischen Sinn. Sie vereinigt führende Staatsmänner des japanischen Kaiserreiches und der anderen Staaten des
A long war was waged between the Jewish Freemasonic Internationalist Bolsheviks and the Chinese nationalists between the years 1927 and 1950. During World War II, when Japan invaded China, the war between the Chinese nationalist and Judeo-Masonic Bolshevik forces did not cease. Japan did all it could to aid China in freeing itself from international Jewry. The trinity of Jewish Freemasons in America, Britain, and the Soviet Union now attempted to spread Bolshevism in China. But like many nations around the world, China too was awakening to the reality of the Judeo-Masonic conspiracy against the nations of the world. Chinese nationalists were inspired by their own brands of fascism and National Socialism. Not only did China fashion their military after the German Wehrmacht, but they also sent their officers to be trained by the Germans. Additionally, as this film shows, China also purchased German military supplies for their army. All in all, China became the third largest trading partner with Adolf Hitler's National Socialist Germany. Unfortunately, all of this was abruptly put to jeopardy when the Second Sino-Japanese War broke out in 1937. A few years later, Germany had no choice but to stand with its Japanese ally and discontinue its partnership with China. China had sadly been influenced far too greatly by the Jewish deep state within. The Chinese nation was being yet again strangled by the tentacles of Jewish influence.
This situation led to the outbreak of the North China Incident. The Nanking government started a series of infringements in North China, resulting in the Japanese army to take security and self-defense measures to prevent further expansion of such events. On his way to the international settlement, First Lieutenant Isao Oyama, head of the Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces, was shot to death when his car was suddenly surrounded by members of the Chinese Peace Prevention Corps, who fired several dozen bullets at Oyama. The spot where he was shot was in the demilitarized zone established under the Shanghai Ceasefire Agreement. This incident was a well-planned act of provocation against uniformed members of the Imperial Japanese Navy. In all areas of Shanghai, Japanese residents, Chinese people, and other foreigners started to evacuate the danger zones immediately after the news spread. In the meantime, the Japanese military was mobilized as an emergency measure to protect Japanese residents and the nation's interests, but with only a small number of soldiers. Their intent was to seek ways for a negotiated settlement. The Japanese military tightened security against Chinese soldiers dozens of times bigger in size. The Chinese military showered machine gun fire against the Japanese military at 10 a.m. on August 13th. Finally, we had no choice but to fire back to defend ourselves. A little past 9 a.m. the following day, Chinese bombers suddenly flew over the headquarters of the Special Navy Landing Forces and launched an airstrike. Then the Chinese started a formation bombing on the Japanese consulate, military ships, and many of our bases. We fired back as well and drove them off. However, all of Shanghai City was thrown into turmoil as the Chinese military planes launched airstrikes even over the city's demilitarized zones. The Chinese military planes also launched a bombing campaign over the entertainment districts in the city, filled with several thousands of Chinese and foreign civilians. It was reportedly said that 940 people were killed and 1,400 others were injured because of this catastrophic bombing.
An Axis freedom fighter victory of World War II, a war that should have never been, would have been the only way to free China of the internal suffering caused by internationalist communists. In 1941, National Socialist Germany signed the Tripatriot Pact along with Imperial Japan and Fascist Italy. In July of 1941, Germany officially recognized Wang Jingwei's Japanese-backed government in Nanking, ending all contact and cooperation with Czech's Chinese government. After the United States entered the war, China capitulated completely to Judeo-Masonic pressures and formally joined International Jury's Allied forces declaring war on Germany, Japan, Italy, and the rest of the Axis freedom fighters on December 9th of 1941. China was splitting apart, torn by international Jewish communist forces and various nationalist factions caught up with too much infighting. The soul of the Chinese people had no leg to stand on any longer. Jingwei himself had constant disputes with nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek. Eventually, Jingwei would travel to National Socialist Germany and meet with Adolf Hitler and many other National Socialist Germans. In December of 1935, after returning to China, Jingwei permanently left the premiership after being severely wounded by an assassination attempt a month earlier. Jingwei fled with Chiang Kai-shek's government on its retreat to Cheongqing during the Second Sino-Japanese War, which lasted from the years 1937 to 1945. Although he had initially worked with the Judeo-Freemasonic Soviet Communists when it furthered his aims, he was now known to be strongly anti-Soviet, anti-Freemasonry, anti-Jewish, and thus anti-communist. During his time in Cheongqing, he organized nationalistic groups inspired by European fascist movements inside the Chinese government. Jingwei was pessimistic about the war with Japan. He believed that China should negotiate with Japan and work together to resist the Jewish-controlled Allied powers of the West. In late 1938, Jingwei left Cheongqing for Vietnam, where he stayed for 3 months and announced his support for a negotiated settlement with the Japanese. During his stay in Indochina, he was wounded again in an assassination attempt by communist Bolshevik assassins. This was the catalyst he needed. Wang flew to Shanghai and entered into negotiations with the Japanese authorities. The Japanese invasion had presented him with a golden opportunity. Finally, he was able to attempt to establish a new government separate from that of Chiang Kai-shek. On the 30th of March 1940, Wang Jingwei became the head of state of what was known as the Reorganized National Government of China. In November of 1940, the Reorganized National Government of China signed the Sino-Japanese Treaty with the Japanese. In June of 1941, Jingwei gave a public radio address where he praised Japan and criticized Chiang Kai-shek's government. In this radio address, Jingwei pledged to work with Japan to resist communism and Western imperialism. Jingwei's government of national salvation of the Republic of China was born on the three principles of Pan-Asianism, anti-communism, and opposition of Chiang Kai-shek. Jingwei continued his contact with German nationalists, Italian fascists, and other Axis freedom fighters throughout the following years until his death in late 1944. In March of 1944, Jingwei went to Japan for medical treatment for the wound he received from the 1939 assassination attempt. He died in Nagoya, Japan on November the 10th of 1944. The criminal assassins had at last killed him. Jingwei was buried in a marvelous tomb in Nanjing. Shortly after Japan's defeat, the Chinese establishment under Chiang Kai-shek moved its capital back to Nanjing, destroyed Jingwei's tomb, and burned his remains to ashes. Most of Jingwei's nationalist followers, comrades, and senior government were executed at the end of the war in order to distance China from the losing side of World War II. Japan's war with China came to be categorized by alleged Japanese atrocities. Like their German counterparts, the Japanese have been vilified without end by international juries post-war Allied propaganda. There is no doubt that the war in China was savage and brutal beyond imagination, but Allied post-war propaganda with its agenda to demonize the Axis freedom fighter forces only portrays one side of the war: the pro-international jury side. The communist Bolshevik Jew-led Chinese forces, the warlord and criminal gangs, the black marketeers and bandits have all their crimes covered up and forgotten. They are portrayed as heroes according to the narrative of World War II spun by Jewish-controlled media and academia. This, of course, is untrue. The reality was that the war in China was supremely bloody and violent for everyone. All forces were guilty of savagery at any given time, for such is the nature of war. But as the old saying goes, the victors decide who the war criminals are. The winners write history. The Japanese and Chinese were not butchering each other in most cases. There was mercy and gentleness shown in many cases between the Japanese and Chinese during World War II. Japan and the Axis freedom fighter forces would have saved China from the clutches of international Jewry and Freemasonry.
The so-called Nanking Massacre was a fabrication. At the Battle of Shanghai in 1937, when the Chinese military of more than 30,000 soldiers attacked Shanghai, many people were killed. Not only Japanese, but also Chinese and many Westerners. That was the beginning of the Sino-Japanese War. To stop the threat of the spread of communist Bolshevism, Japan decided to occupy Nanking not very differently than the German occupation of Eastern Europe. The goal had always been to defend the nations against the international menace. The alleged Nanking Massacre is a narrative that claims that the Japanese military massacred Chinese civilians on a large scale in December of 1937. According to the narrative, the Japanese army committed numerous atrocities such as rape, looting, arson, and executions of POWs and civilians that violated the Geneva Conventions. It is claimed that the Japanese massacred about 300,000 Chinese people in Nanking during the 6 weeks after the Japanese occupation of the city. On the wall of the Nanking Massacre Memorial Hall in China is written the number 300,000 as the total number of massacred victims. However, newspapers, photos, documentary films, and testimonies in those days all indicate that the Nanking Massacre of 300,000 people, whether a large-scale massacre or even a small-scale massacre, simply did not take place. The so-called Nanking Massacre was a total fabrication and deceptive atrocity propaganda spread by the Allied powers for their political purposes. This is a picture of the Japanese military's ceremonial entry into Nanking on December the 17th of 1937. That is 4 days after the fall of Nanking. The Chinese civilians are wearing armbands of the flag of Japan, which were given to all civilians of Nanking to distinguish them from hiding enemy soldiers disguised in civilian clothing. The citizens of Nanking welcomed the Japanese military, giving them cheers because they had developed great resentment against the communist soldiers who had committed terrible deeds against the people in the city. From 1937 to 1938, the spokesman Chiang Kai-shek of the Chinese Nationalist Party gave about 300 press interviews. In none of them did he mention anything about civilians being massacred in Nanking, nor the illegal executions of any prisoners of war. The first chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, Mao Zedong, likewise also never mentioned anything about the Nanking massacre his entire life. Before and during the occupation of Nanking, the Japanese military installed a safety zone inside Nanking to protect civilians. According to the announcement of the Westerners of the International Committee, which took care of the Nanking safety zone, the population of Nanking just before the fall of the city was about 200,000. How could the Japanese military massacre 300,000 people in a city that has only 200,000 people? Soon after, the Westerners of the International Committee also announced that the Nanking population had increased to about 250,000 only 1 month after the occupation. This information is based on food ration records the Japanese kept. Records indicate that the Japanese military supplied food rations good for about 250,000 civilians in Nanking. How could the Japanese have massacred 300,000 people in a city of 200,000 people that grew to 250,000 people 1 month later? Why would the Japanese supply the entire city with food rations if they intended to massacre them? In fact, the peace and safety that the Japanese military brought became so attractive that many Chinese civilians near Nanking came to the city to enjoy the protection of the Japanese military. If Nanking were a city of a massacre, why would Chinese civilians come back to Nanking? There are some people who say that even if the massacre of 300,000 people by the Japanese military did not happen in Nanking, there must have still been many atrocities that were committed by Japanese soldiers, since there were many letters written by Westerners who had resided in Nanking reporting numerous atrocities such as rapes, lootings, and murders allegedly committed by Japanese soldiers. It is a fact that many of the Westerners in Nanking had believed that the atrocities in the city had been committed by Japanese soldiers. However, the letters they sent had no confirmations. They were based on hearsay and rumors that were spread by partisan civilians and sometimes even by enemy soldiers disguised as civilians. In fact, Tokayasu Fukuda, who had been in Nanking as a probationary diplomat of the Japanese embassy, testified that, quote, "The nature of my duties requires me to visit the office of the International Committee almost every day. At the office I saw Chinese men come in one after another saying, 'Japanese soldiers are now raping 15 or 16-year-old girls in such and such a place,' or 'Japanese soldiers are committing looting at a house in such and such a street,' etc. Reverend Maggie, Reverend Fitch, and several others were typing these charges immediately to report to their countries. I warned them again and again, 'Wait please, do not report them without confirming first.' Occasionally I hurried with them to the scene of the supposed misdeeds but found nothing. Nobody living there, and no trace of validity to any of the reports. I experienced such cases often." End quote. Despite the overwhelming contradictory reality in Nanking, the accusatory letters were sent to the US. The Westerners in Nanking were confident in their beliefs that Japanese soldiers were committing such atrocities, but that had changed on January the 4th of 1938, about 3 weeks after the fall of Nanking. On that day, the New York Times reported the arrests of the Chinese men who had committed numerous atrocities in Nanking. The Chinese men confessed in front of the Westerners that it was they who had committed the atrocities in an attempt to scapegoat the Japanese military. The Westerners were embarrassed by these confessions because it was they who had harbored them up until that time. Similar arrests of Chinese partisans and undercover soldiers occurred on the 25th of January and the 17th of February that same year. After these arrests, the atrocities in Nanking stopped completely. As for the arrested partisans and enemy soldiers, the most malicious of them were appropriately executed for their crimes. Those who were only guilty of spreading rumors and false information were eventually released and allowed to return to their homelands outside of Nanking. There was even a Chinese soldier named Liu Kixong who had been hiding in the safety zone. He was captured and interned as a prisoner of war. Seeing the good treatment of the Chinese civilians in Nanking and the positive view of the Chinese civilians regarding the Japanese military, he defected from his side and became a volunteer for the Japanese cause. He was a coolie for a while, but later rose to become a commander for a brigade under Wang Jingwei's pro-Japanese government in Nanking. These are pictures of Chinese civilians celebrating the start of Nanking's self-government in January of 1938. They are waving the Japanese flag as well as the Chinese five-colored flag only 1 month after the fall of Nanking. Are these the scenes of a massacred city? Every person in Nanking at the time knew that there was no massacre in Nanking, but there were anti-Japanese interests who thought they could make the people outside of Nanking believe that there was a massacre and a lot of Japanese atrocities being committed in Nanking. In 1938, the book entitled What War Means, written by H.J. Temperley, was published. Temperley, who was not in Nanking, but rather in Shanghai, wrote in his book sensationally about the massacres of civilians in Nanking. This book is famous for its strong influence in shaping the public opinions of Americans regarding the events of Nanking under Japanese occupation. In fact, Zhang Kushbai, the chief of the China Information Committee, writes in his autobiography, quote, "We decided that our first step was to make payments to Temperley and to Smith in order that they may write and publish 2 books for us as witnesses to the Nanking massacre. Thus Temperley became our secret man in charge of propaganda in America." End quote. Thus, long before the self-incited attack on Pearl Harbor, Temperley and his book were part of the Allied propaganda to make the American people believe that the Japanese were evil and to drag the United States into war against Japan. This was how the lie of the Nanking massacre spread to the world. In 1932, Shiro Ishii creates Unit 731. Unit 731's title for the public was the Epidemic Prevention and Water Supply Unit of the Kwantung Army. Accusations against Unit 731 are as follows. It is claimed that 12,000 Manchurians and 186 American POWs were killed by the Unit 731. It is also claimed that the Japanese Imperial Army unit killed thousands of Chinese and Russians held prisoner in Japanese-occupied Manchuria in experiments to develop chemical and biological weapons. These accusations come from several sources that point out the following.
The important questions to be asked are these.
boycotting Japanese goods in Manchuria.
Deadly flamethrowers at their powers, dear friend.
They offer their own salute for United Nations. But the League of Nations and
The truth about Unit 731, however, is very different. In 2007, the US disclosed the entire 10,000-page document on the Unit 731 and proved that the alleged human experiments were all fabrications. The document proved that Unit 731 was a disease control unit that was formed to protect Chinese civilians from epidemics and the bacterial warfare conducted by the Kuomintang against Japan's military and Chinese civilians. The entire document is available to the public at the United States National Archives. On the 26th of May 1982, the United States Congress sought formal comments from the Department of State on biological warfare experiments carried out by General Shiro Ishii. On the 10th of March 1983, Senator Bill Bradley called a formal congressional inquiry on the alleged experimentation on humans by the Japanese during World War II. The United States Department of Defense held a question and answer session regarding Unit 731 on May the 12th of 1995. The DoD concluded that, quote, "There does not appear to be any documentary evidence to support the claims that the United States POWs were subject to biological experimentation by the Japanese Army during World War II." The Department of Veterans Affairs' responses to the press inquiries on Mukden POWs on July the 14th of 1995 stated the following, quote, "No confirming evidence has yet been presented that biological warfare experiments were conducted on those POWs who were held in Mukden." According to the National Security Council press guidance, Japanese biological warfare experiments in World War II, NSC provided a summary of the claims by POWs that they were the objects of biological weapons experiments by the Japanese. NSC noted that over the years of exhaustive searching, quote, "We have not been able to locate conclusive evidence that the United States POWs were subjects of biological warfare experiments," end quote. For further information, please visit the Society for the Dissemination of Historical Fact on the following website. This website in English contains many books and articles in PDF files that completely debunk the lies about Japan generated by the post-war Allied propaganda of international Jewry.
We come to the Japanese city of Kobe, to the office of Toshimi Mizobuchi. Anita McNaught from the BBC. My translator, Mai. May we come in? We'd heard that unlike Unit 731 scientists, he's prepared to speak openly. He organizes the annual staff reunion party. He showed us a photo of last year's event. First, he regaled us with tales of the unit's great achievements. It was a water purification unit, a hygiene bureau, a medical college. Was there ever a time when you thought the work you were doing at 731 was wrong, was inhumane?
No. 深く世界の体制と帝国の現状度に鑑み、以上の措置をもって自局を収集せんと欲し、ここに重量なる汝臣民に次ぐ秦は帝国政府をして米英祖四国に対し、この共同宣言を受諾する旨通告せしめたり、そもそも帝国市民の公寧を図り、万邦共栄の楽しみを共にするは放送の違反にして秦の権限語るところに米英二国に変遷せるゆえんもまた実に帝国の自尊と共和の安定とを主揮するにつけ、他国の主権を排し平等春日ごときは元より金が志にあらず、さらに応戦戦作用を背にし、金が一回将兵の優先、金が百両融資の冷静、金が一億収書の方向、おのおの最善を尽くせるに変わらず、戦局必ずしも好転せず、世界の体制また我にであらず、不可のみならず、敵は新たに残虐なる爆弾を使用してしけれに向こうを殺傷し、残骸の及ぶところ真にかかるべからざるに至る。しかもなお応戦を継続せんか、ついに我が民族の滅亡を将来するのみならず、非定人類の文明をも破却すべし、核の軍馬金何をもってか不調の石種を欲し、構想の神殿に所詮や、これ金が帝国政府をして共同宣言に応ぜすめるに至れるゆえんなり、金は帝国とともに中止共和の会合に協力せる諸名法に対し遺憾の要表せざるを得ず、帝国人民にして先人に死し、職域に順に記名に倒れたる者及びその貴族に思いをいたせば、来ないために咲く、かつ戦勝を追い成果を被り、家業を失いたる者、王政に至りては金の深く因縁するところなり、思うに今後帝国の置くべき苦難はもとより尋常にあらず、汝市民の友情も金よくこれを知る。誰とも金は自分の持つところ、上がたきを耐え、忍びがたきを忍び、もって万世のために大地を開かんと欲し。金はここに国体を保持し得て、重要なる汝市民の歴史にし、戦汝市民と共にあり、もしそれ上納撃するところ、左に時短を刺激し、あるいは同胞廃棄、互いに自力を乱り、ために大道を誤り、真理を世界に失うがごときは、真最もこれを戒しむ。よろしく。巨国一家子孫愛伝え、固く信州の不滅を信じに目して日東京を思い、総力を将来の建設に傾け、道義を厚くし、思想を固くし、誓って国体の成果を発揚し、世界の市民に遅れざらんことを期すべし。汝市民、それよく金が用体せよ。
The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, or Tokyo Trial, lasted from 1946 to 1948. From the Manchurian Incident in 1931 to the Marco Polo Bridge Incident in 1937, Japan was involved in the Sino-Japanese War. The process from the start of the war between Japan and the United States of America in 1941 and the end of the war in 1945 was determined to be a war of aggression by Japan. The act of planning, preparing for, starting and implementing this war of aggression was judged as a crime against peace, for which Hideki Tojo and 6 others were executed by hanging.
The proposition that killing in war is not murder. That killing in war is not murder follows from the fact that war is legal. This legalized killing, justifiable homicide technically perhaps, however repulsive, however abhorrent, has never been thought of as imposing criminal responsibility. If the killing of Admiral Kidd by the bombing of Pearl Harbor is murder, we know the name of the very man whose hands loosed the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. We know the Chief of Staff who planned that act. We know the Chief of the responsible state. Is murder on their consciences? We may well doubt it. We may well doubt it. And not because the event of the armed conflict has declared their cause just and their enemies unjust. Because the act is not murder. Show us the charge. Produce the proof. Killing contrary to the laws and customs of war. Name the man whose hand dealt the blow. Produce the responsible superior who planned, ordered, permitted, or acquiesced in this act. And you have brought a criminal to the bar of justice.
Among all the prosecutors participating in the Tokyo trial, Justice Radhabinod Paul was the only expert in international law. He was an Indian citizen and the only Asian jurist among all the judges at the Tokyo trials. Justice Paul insisted throughout the trials that Japan was innocent according to international law. In fact, he was extremely worried that Japanese school textbooks would use the historical notion created by the Tokyo trial to teach that Japan committed the crime of aggressive violence, and Japan committed an international crime. Justice Paul even offered the following words of encouragement: "I cannot stand idly by and watch future generations of Japanese children be burdened with a warped sense of guilt which infects them with servility and decay." Indeed, just as prophesied by Justice Paul during the Tokyo trial, the historical notion created by the Tokyo trial has inflicted a deep wound on Japan that still remains today after 70 years. After being defeated in the war, Japan had lost confidence, and Japanese people were searching for their identity, both ideologically and culturally. At this time, Justice Paul's message was undoubtedly a source of courage and hope. We must never forget Justice Paul's benevolent gift to the Japanese people. Justice Paul wrote the following words of grief: "The Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan has taken the trouble to politely issue an English pamphlet which apologizes for Japan's sins and even expresses gratitude for the Tokyo trial. For the Asian value of modest virtue to be exhibited to such an extent is almost pitiful. Why can't Japan stand up for what is right and point out what is wrong? Justice Paul visited the cenotaph for the atomic bomb victims, offering flowers and silent prayers. Upon noticing the inscription on the cenotaph, he asked his translator to explain the meaning. "Let all the souls here rest in peace, for we shall not repeat the fault." Upon confirming the meaning of the inscription several times, Justice Paul's expression became grave. Obviously, the subject of "we" is Japanese. I do not see clearly what "the fault" means here. The souls being wished to rest here are the victims of the atomic bomb. It is clear to me that the bomb was not dropped by Japanese and the hands of bombers remain blood-stained. If the phrase, "we shall not repeat the fault," were to be assigned to those responsible for the bombing, then this inscription would possess true meaning. If the fault refers to the Greater East Asian War, then Japan is once again free from blame. Western European countries that invaded Asia sowed the seeds of that war. Furthermore, America imposed the ABCD encirclement as economic sanctions on Japan, eventually provoking Japan by placing an embargo on oil and an ultimatum in the form of the Hull Note. Is it not clear that the United States of America is responsible for the outbreak of war? The extent of Justice Paul's grievance is evidenced in his following statement. The Tokyo trial was conducted by demagogues of wartime propaganda. The purpose of the trial was to implicate Japan as responsible for all wrongdoings. I would have never believed how such deceit has crushed the spirit of the Japanese people. The Tokyo trial has inflicted even greater damage than the atomic bomb. When time shall have softened passion and prejudice, when reason shall have stripped the mask from misrepresentation, then justice, holding evenly her scales, will require much of past censure and praise to change places. WWII Paul.
このリビジョニストという言葉がね、アメリカで今非常に流行ってですね、日本のが立派な国であったと言おうとすると、すぐにリビジョニストと言って批判するのが盛んです。そしてリビジョニストと言われますと、みんながね、これアメリカ人もね、研究していますから、日本は悪かったんじゃないんだという学者がいっぱい出るんですよ。それでもリビジョニストと言われるとね、社会的地位を失う恐れがあるんです。 だから我々はですね、今70年、戦後70年を機会にして、どうしても破らなきゃならないのは東京裁判所官です。あれで日本を締め付けられてるんです。だから、それを破る手は、一番有力なのはあるんです。マッカーサーが最大の、しかも一番最初のレジジョニストでした。東京裁判を見直して、あれは日本の自衛のためだと宣言してくれた最初の人ですよ。だから我々はレビジョニストと言われたらマッカーサーに戻りましょう。アメリカの軍事外交の最高の、場所で証言するんです。ですから証言だからね、ここは注意してもらいたいんです。マッカーサーがこれから言ったことはですね、それはマッカーサーがつぶやいたことじゃないんです。友達に言ったことでもないんです。奥さんに言ったことでもないんです。日記に書いたことでもないんです。本に書いたことでもないんです。それはアメリカの軍事外交合同委員会というアメリカの最高の公の場で証言してるんです。だから歴史的です。動かない歴史的です。そこで彼はですね、趣旨から言いますね、近代産業として、持っているものは蚕しかいなかったです。絹産業しかないんです。それで鉄だとかね、石油だとか何だとか缶だとか近代産業に必要なのは全部東南アジアにあった。それを我々は売らないことにしたのだ。従って日本人はこのままでいくならば直ちに1000万人ないし1200万人の失業者が出ることが明らかになった。従って日本が戦争に突入したのは安全保障のために余儀なくされたことであったと。
There is practically nothing indigenous to Japan except the silkworm. They lack cotton, they lack wool, they lack petroleum products, they lack tin, they lack rubber, and they lack a great many other things, all of which was in the Asiatic basin. They feared that if those supplies were cut off, there would be 10 to 12 million people unoccupied in Japan. Their purpose, therefore, in going to war was largely dictated by security.
Their purpose, their purpose, therefore, in going to war was largely dictated by security. したがって彼らの戦争に行った目的は主として安全保障のために余儀なくされたものである。もう東京裁判パンクしてます。東京裁判そのものですよ、マッカーサーは。で彼が日本は、侵略国であって軍国であって悪質な国であって悪魔の国のようだという建前にやった張本人がですね、あれは自衛のためだと証明したんです。
Hamilton Fish was a prominent Republican politician of the same generation as President Roosevelt. In his book, FDR, The Other Side of the Coin, How We Were Tricked into World War II, Fish undertakes a critical examination of how Roosevelt was determined to involve the United States of America into war and his responsibility for deceiving Congress to make World War II. Let us consider the following excerpt from Fish's book. Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe sought peace through negotiation with America. However, President Roosevelt continually rejected Konoe's request for a meeting between the two leaders. The United States presented Japan with an ultimatum in the form of the Hull Note, in an attempt to goad Japan into war. By doing so, the United States of America would then be able to declare war on Germany. Fish also states the following. There was strong opposition from within America regarding entry into a European war. Accordingly, in order to declare war, the Roosevelt administration needed America to be attacked by another country. Therefore, the government allowed Pearl Harbor to be attacked, thus gaining overwhelming public support for entering into war. In addition to the Hull Note being an ultimatum towards Japan, the very existence of the note was hidden after the start of the war. This led to the American public believing that Japan had launched a surprise attack in the midst of peace negotiations. According to the government's plan, this created passionate support for Roosevelt's call for war. Japan fought courageously to the bitter end. There must never be another war between the United States and Japan. There is nothing revisionary about an attempt to fairly examine the history of a nation and its people. I seek nothing more than to wipe away the one-sided post-war bias and conduct a fair examination of the past, recognizing what is truly right and wrong. This is the proper stance to be taken by an independent nation. Furthermore, such a fair examination of history will enable foreign diplomacy on equal terms. As was clearly shown in the case of comfort women, this series of contrived and distorted historical events must be corrected. However, there are some parties to whom this distorted history is a justificatory political tool. These parties will fiercely resist the correction of history and will not hesitate to apply the label of revisionist. It is vital that we possess the courage to pursue the truth without giving into the pressure of anti-Japan propaganda.
大東亜戦争中、ジャワ海で昭和17年の3月に、漂流しているイギリスの海軍の将兵たちをですね、通りがかった日本の駆逐艦が救助して、ただ救助するのみならず、その汚物と油にまみれていたイギリスの将兵たちを非常に懇切丁寧に水兵たちが体を洗ってあげて、かつ食料も供給し、そして非常に優遇してくれたと。しかも艦長が、日本の海軍の艦長がですね、健闘をたたいて、諸官たちは勇敢に戦われたと、共和帝国海軍のゲストであるというスピーチをされたということを聞いてですね、私は身振りしたんですね。これが一つの起点になりまして、この自虐痴漢、昭和海軍否定論が解消されていくわけですけれども、私は翌年にはすぐイギリスに飛びまして、そして当時の関係者の方々にお会いして取材したわけです。その時に、その昭和16年の12月10日、マレー沖海戦で、日本海軍と戦った、プリンス・オブ・ウェールズに乗っておられた、グラム・アレン海軍大尉がですね、私にこう言ったんですね。君は日本に帰ったら、ぜひ自分たちのリスペクトと感謝を伝えてくれということだったんです。どういうことかと言いますと、日本海軍をおよび帝国陸軍を攻撃するために、マレー半島に上陸した帝国陸軍を艦砲射撃するためにですね、クワンタン沖を北上中のイギリス東洋艦隊旗艦プリンス・オブ・ウェールズでの話なんですけど、東洋艦隊司令長官のサー・フリップ提督に対してですね、グラム・アレン大尉は当時副官をやっておられたそうですから、意見具申をされたということですね。どういったことかというと、日本海軍航空隊っていうのは非常に強力なので、油断をされては危険ではないでしょうかという意見具申をしましたら、フィリップ提督が、黄色い猿どもが何ができるかと一生に付されたと。ところが、日本の海軍航空隊の攻撃が始まりやですね、フィリップ提督は顔面蒼白になって、こんな見事な攻撃を見たことがないと絶句されたそうですね。で、その後に2時間で世界最強不沈戦艦と言われたプリンス・オブ・ウェールズは我が海軍航空隊の攻撃を受けてですね、2時間で沈没していくんですけども、その時の後の行為に非常にびっくりしたと。指揮官機が攻撃やめの合図をすると、 日本海軍の航空隊は一切攻撃をやめて救助活動を妨害しなかったらしいんです。それで洋上でですね、プリンス・オブ・ウェールズ随伴艦のレパルスに随伴していた駆逐艦軍はですね、それぞれの主力艦の原則に横付けして洋上でですね、救助活動に入ったということです。ちなみに太平洋では洋上ではですね、日本海軍がそういうことをしたときにはアメリカ海軍は容赦なく攻撃してですね、救助の駆逐艦もろとも撃沈するという非人道的なことをしてたんですけども、帝国海軍は決してそういうことはせずに救助活動を洋上で見守ってですね、しかもその後が非常に私は胸を打ったんですよ。クアンタン沖から母港のシンガポールに帰る間、日本の海軍航空隊はですね、上空援護をしてくれたと。黄色い猿と思って、東洋人を馬鹿にしてた自分たちがですね、非常に情けなく思いましたと。こんな見事なね、その攻撃と、そしてそのチームワーク、統制力、そして武士道に対して非常に自分たちは感激したと言っておりましたですね。それでそのグラム・アーレン隊が私に最後に言った言葉、これが私はもう生涯忘れられないのはですね、プリンス・オブ・ウェールズの沈没はイギリス帝国主義の終焉を意味しましたということを言ったときに、私はね、大東亜戦争っていうのはアジア解放の戦いだったと先輩方が言われた言葉が、敵が勝手の旧敵から確認することができてね、非常に私は感激いたしました。とかく今日本では自虐史観といいまして侵略戦争だったと言ってるんですけどもね、私はそうは思いません。これだけ先人たちが自分の命を変えてですね、このアジア民族の独立と解放のために戦ってくれたっていうのを非常に実感しましたですね。
激戦の最中に400名以上の敵の命を救った工藤艦長。彼の残した誇り高き真の武士道の姿は今も多くの人々の心の中に生き続けている。
自分が死ぬ前にどうしても一言お礼を言いたかったのです。この出来事は日本人に対して持つ私の印象にずっと影響を与えました。深い尊敬と感謝の念を抱いています。
Following World War I in 1919, Japan proposed the inclusion of a racial equality clause at the Paris Peace Conference. This proposal was based on the spirit of Pakko Ichiu, all the world under one roof, an ideal revered by the Japanese since ancient times. However, in April 1919, Japan's proposal was rejected at a meeting of the League of Nations, mainly due to opposition by President Wilson of the United States. Furthermore, the United States began to conduct anti-Japanese activities at a national level, including the enactment of the Immigration Act of 1924, which restricted immigration to the United States of America by Japanese citizens. Nitobe Inazo, an Undersecretary General of the League of Nations, was extremely disappointed once the United States enacted legislation restricting immigration by Japanese citizens. Afterwards, acting at the request of Emperor Showa, Nitobe worked tirelessly to serve as a bridge between the two countries. Although rejected at the Paris Peace Conference, Japan's proposal for racial equality was finally realized after 30 years had passed in 1948. As the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at the Third General Assembly of the United Nations. However, Japanese people were still inflicted with a one-sided sense of atonement towards the war as a result of the War Guilt Information Program infused by GHQ's initiative. A plan designed to brainwash the Japanese and instill a feeling of guilt regarding the war. In addition to concealing America's responsibility for the war, This program aimed to crush the morale of Japanese people so that Japan would never again resist against the United States of America. Furthermore, media restrictions enforced by a press code made it impossible to criticize the Tokyo trial or to report trials taking place in China and Korea. Many Japanese people were instilled with a feeling of guilt towards the war, believing that Japan is an evil nation that invaded other countries. The spiritual cohesiveness of Japanese people was crushed by methodical actions to disparage the tradition and history that were the source of national pride. Eventually, it succeeded to completely dispel patriotism, to instigate distrust toward government leaders amongst citizens, and to divide public opinion by encouraging communist activity under the name of democracy.
And then at that point, MacArthur, who had been standing further in, walked very strongly towards him and said, "You are very, very welcome, sir," and took the emperor both hands, both of his hands in the emperor's one hand. The emperor's hand was shaking like that, trembling, and he bowed very low so that the handshake was over his head. He thought he might have come to sort of save his skin, so to speak, but instead the emperor had offered himself as a Mingawari. Kill me, but not those who acted in my name. And MacArthur was so astonished by that he knew from that moment that here was a very precious man that had to be preserved for many, many reasons. And he did.
We ask that adults in today's society convey true Japanese history to children who will become responsible for the future of our nation. We hope that our children will feel pride in having been born in noble Japan and will hold courage and aspiration in their hearts. History is written by the winners and is further distorted to the benefits of major countries that were involved in that history. The historical awareness created by the Tokyo trial is the basis for history studied at Japanese school and the interpretation of Showa period history by the mass media. Therefore, almost all Japanese people are brainwashed by that historical awareness. Spies and propaganda have distorted the history of Japanese war. Japan has always acted in good faith at foreign diplomacy with other countries. Unfortunately, Japan mistakenly believed that America, Russia, and China are also countries that respect good faith in their relations. As a result, Japan was deceived into entering war and was ultimately labeled as an evil country that embarks on wars of aggression. Although Japan lost the Greater East Asian War, Japan's brave example led to an uprising by people throughout Asia in their quest for independence. Afterwards, this movement spread to countries in Africa also. After 500 years, the era of colonization by the white man was finally brought to an end. Indeed, the nations of the world have reached to the stage to realize the ideal of a generation without colonization because Japan took defiant action in order to create a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere.